Yes, we can. You may begin.
Thanks for
Make us
that.
proud and your mom proud.
Excellent.
She's watching today.
Well, I'm happy to see everybody. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. We are talking all about whales, and I'm very happy to be back here with the National Biodiversity Teach-In. My name is Lindsay Hirt. I'm a marine biologist and an 8th grade science teacher from Plymouth, Massachusetts. I work in New England, and this is my 5th presentation with National Biodiversity Teach-In. I've been involved since its inception in 2014, and I think it is an absolutely amazing opportunity to be in contact with the world and to express interest in all things nature and learn more about biodiversity. So welcome, everybody. And Kelly, I see you on there. Welcome. Today my presentation is on humpback whales, and I have presented on whales before, so any of you who have seen any of my previous presentations with Nat Bio Teach-In, you might notice a few pieces of information that are similar. I decided to focus on humpback whales today in particular because of their massive size and their gentle reputation, and the fact that we're presenting from the East Coast today. These animals are really symbols of this area, and they're a great way to deliver a message of conservation, and it's really important to appreciate them in their role in the environment. So let's begin by taking a look here at our first humpback whale of the day. Can everybody see my slides that I have up? Should say hooray for humpbacks. There is a whale in the water here, and it is a tiny little baby at only about 16 feet long. This picture was taken in 2015, and it is the calf of a humpback whale named Rune. At the time, it was only about 15, 16 feet long and less than 6 months old. So that's the kind of size that we are talking about here. Today, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about these whales and where we're broadcasting from. I'm going to tell you a little bit about their life history, where they go, what they do. I'm going to point out some really cool features of their anatomy, and you can see for yourself up close and personal some features you may not have seen before. We'll observe some of the very best of their behaviors, and then we will wrap up by discussing some of the ways that you can take action to help whales and other organisms in our ocean and be part of the positive change that comes with working on biodiversity. So here we go. All right, so next slide, here we are in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. This is where I'm broadcasting from. Actually, just off Cape in this little area, some of you may know it, it's called Plymouth, America's hometown. And this area is really, really special because of its unique aquatic environment. As you can see, this area, which sticks out like an arm, is completely surrounded by water on 3 sides, which makes it essentially a pretty cool living laboratory. A lot of different interesting animals visit this region, including and especially our beloved favorites, the humpback whales. It's because of this amazing, unique ability to produce very fertile water. If you were to look into the water, if you're swimming or you're in a boat on Cape Cod, you're going to notice the water looks really green, unlike this nice little map left to us by Woods Hole Oceanographic. And what you would see is just color, and it looks a little bit like the water is very dirty. That's actually not the case at all. It turns out that the reason why these aren't clear, perfect waters like you might see in Mexico, if you're diving, is because of the immense amount of life in them. See, here in these northern cool waters, what we end up getting is a lot of life due to oxygen, really cool oxygenated water. And the fact that just north of Cape Cod, we have this bank, right here, I'll outline it, this area known as Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary. This shallow water allows sunlight to penetrate fairly well into our water and to provide some of that extra nutrient load that we need to produce a good food source. If you mix that with the fact that we actually have good water mixing, to say the word twice, we have great currents here. That current is known as upwelling. And what upwelling is this process where deep, cold water rises to the surface. And it replaces the surface water and brings to the surface lots and lots of nutrients that are exposed to that sunlight. And as anyone here who might be a gardener would know, if you mix sunlight and nutrients and good, clean water, you have yourself a very fertile environment. And this is what makes high biodiversity here on Cape Cod. Let's move to the next slide, and I'll tell you a bit about some of the animals that come to this area. There are about animals that come to this area. There are about 14 marine mammals that make their way, either live full-time or come for a portion of the year in a migration to Stellwagen Bank and the Cape Cod region. They are all in the order Cetacea. Cetacea is another word to say whale, basically. And it includes all the whales, dolphins, and porpoises in that family. So here in Cape Cod, we see about 5 types of whales per year, as well as some other marine mammals like seals. Although there are about 88 to 90, depending on which scientist you're talking to, that are classified as whales, dolphins, and porpoises. These are animals that spend their whole entire life in the ocean. They are very diverse and unique. So if you were to look at one species from another, you would notice some major differences in their size, their anatomy, and their capabilities. The one thing that they all do share is that they spend their whole lives in the ocean. And because they are mammals, they also share the same characteristics that all mammals share, which include things like the fact that they are warm-blooded, like humans. They breathe air. They have lungs just like we do. They give live birth and produce milk for their young. And they also have hair, which is very hard for a lot of people to believe. But in a later slide, I'm going to show you how that actually happens. One other thing I do want to point out in this one is, I'm sure you can see this big boat in the background here that I just circled. From the bow to the stern of this vessel is 137 feet inside. This is the sailing school vessel Roseway. I took this picture about 2 years ago in my own vessel, and I was sitting still with the engines off, and all of a sudden out of the water came 2 gigantic humpback whales, and here they are in the foreground. And I just wanted to point those out because the vessel in the background is quite a large one, so it really puts into perspective, we're just seeing the very tip of the iceberg here with these animals, and they're quite large indeed. So here's the true introduction to the name of the humpback whale. Their scientific name is Megaptera novaangliae. And what that translates to in Latin is the big-winged New Englander. I would love to tell my kids in school if they don't understand some of the words that we're looking at, they should break it apart. So let's do that here. Mega, of course, big. Ptera is related to wings. You may have heard of a pterodactyl. Nova is a relation to the word new, and angliae is a relation to England. So big-winged New Englander, and I'm going to show you why people call them that. One thing that I love about this picture, look really close, the breath of the whale makes an absolutely beautiful rainbow right there. That's quite a unique. So humpback whales are circumglobal, meaning they actually are able to swim in all waters on our globe. And of course, the Earth is made of 71% ocean. That's 71% of our space that we take up is ocean. And so they do actually have quite a lot of places to go. Um, Humpback whales are capable of living in all oceans, but there's very many different populations of them. And one of them is the ones that I study here in New England. These whales, we call them the whales of the Gulf of Maine. And as far as we know, in these waters here, there are about 12,000 individuals. And they are very well known and able to be counted because their behavior is somewhat predictable. They tend to spend a lot of their time very close to the coast, which means that we're able to get out in boats and sometimes even from land and observe them. So what they tend to do is spend the majority of their summers up here in cooler water. These are their feeding grounds up here in the Gulf of Maine and around Massachusetts, where I live, off the coast of Cape Cod. And when the water starts to get a little bit cooler, they kind of make a beeline for the south. And they seem to know their way. So what they tend to do is just swim it down the coast and go right on into the Caribbean Ocean, where they spend their winters in much warmer water, those lucky ducks. They're definitely snowbirds, and it's because they need to carry out different life processes, just like you or me. Except humpback whales, they don't have grocery stores, so they have to find their food where it's most abundant. And as I mentioned before, Cape Cod has very fertile waters due to upwelling and great mixing of water, giving us the ability to have that amazing biodiversity of animals. I will tell you a bit more about what whales eat shortly. But for now, the important thing to know is that these whales migrate. In the summer months, they spend their time up here in the north with us, and in the winter months, they make their way out and they head down to the Caribbean, to the Dominican Republic, very great vacation place. And this is where they mate and give birth to their young. As we saw at the very beginning of this presentation, their young are quite small, usually only the size of a minivan or so, and they're a little bit too skinny to be in cooler water of the northern region. So they like to be born in those southerly parts, and that is where they tend to do best. They nurse off of their mom. They have very thick, fatty milk that they drink for many months before they're weaned. And then, at the end of the winter, in the spring, they make their way back up the coast with mama and end right back up here in the Gulf of Maine region, where they learn to eat on their own and practice the ways of the world with mom in tow. So not only do these new baby whales, which are about 6 months old by the time they reach us, learning from their parents and learning to eat, it also acts as a bit of a nursery for them. So it's really neat what they're able to do. So my question for everybody tonight is to think about, if these whales are spending a lot of time on the coast, what interaction might they have with humans? That's something that's kind of a problem. So I wanted to show you a few photos of some of the interactions that can be had. Right here in this picture, we see a beautiful shot of a very famous female whale named Hancock, and her calf from last year, which has not been named yet. The tail right here is the calf at about 8 months old. This is last summer. And that's a really nice positive interaction. But sometimes we have interactions that are not so nice. This is where we really have to kind of think and be very careful and cautious in how we operate our vessels. One of the most important discussions of our time regarding whales, and in particular the humpback whales, which we enjoy watching so much, is the fact that they are very friendly and slow-moving animals. And so they tend to have negative interactions with boats who either accidentally aren't paying attention or don't realize that the whales are in their area. This slide shows one of my very favorite whales in the world. Her name is Owl. She is an older whale that was born to a female named Falco, and she has brought several calves back to Cape Cod in the past. And she's very well known because of these two marks right here on her tail. You guys see them? This is a little bit of a fuzzy picture because I shrunk it right down, but there's a big dot on either side of her tail, and it reminded some scientists of an owl, so they decided to name her Owl for that, very distinct markings. Owl, unfortunately, is also really well known now for the scars on her back, where she unfortunately had a negative interaction with a boat in the early 1990s. Another example of this sad situation is a whale named Aerospace. This is another a longtime visitor of Cape Cod and New England region. Aerospace had an interaction with a propeller, and you can see right on the back here the lines from that propeller cutting into the skin there. Fortunately, this was not a mortal wound on this animal, but it is something to be really mindful of. And folks like myself who spend a lot of time on whale watch boats or in a personal craft really have to be paying good attention and be communicating with other people to make sure interactions like this do not happen. So moving on, I of course want to mention what impact we have on the ocean. A humpback whale is a really important marine resource, and we have to care about them, of course. But we also have a lot of other things to do too. So I do like to point out that half of all Americans live in coastal watersheds, and that 9 out of the 10 largest cities are coastal. There's a lot of people right along the beach, right? And we use the ocean for everything possible. We have for thousands and thousands of years, for a source of food, for transport of our goods, and for ourselves. We use the ocean for medicine, and for energy, for hydropower, for recreation, of course, all of these things. And it's up to us to be mindful when we are interacting with either creatures in the water or using space that honestly really isn't ours. The ocean is a food source for 3.5 billion people, and in the next 20 years, that number is expected to double. And so it is really important to start thinking about ways that we can better manage the waters that we spend time in. Fishing, the shipping industry, oil and gas exploration, military uses, and of course, whale watching, which is a $2 billion a year industry, are all affecting what is happening to this space. So that has a really great impact on the ocean and the animals. And of course, humpback whales, I'm slightly biased, they are an important natural resource, and they're important to biodiversity. Now, I only have about an hour here, and I could go on forever and ever. I won't unless anyone has any particular questions, which please, folks, if you are interested in typing any messages to me, feel free, and I'll be happy to respond. But I do want to say that humpback whales are, all animals are important to our environment, and they all hold a role in the environment. But whales, they're sort of special to us here in New England. You see, they are a cultural symbol for people who live here. Historically, they were hunted for their blubber, which was an excellent source of oil for burning lamps prior to the invention of electricity. And they were also used for their meat. In some places in the world, like Iceland and Japan, they still are. And that really bit into how many of them existed. And so because their numbers are greatly reduced, they're even more sensitive to having injury to their populations than they might have if they were never hunted. They are, of course, important to ecotourism. I myself am employed by a great whale watch company in the summertime and spend all of my time on boats watching them, and I earn money from doing that as a naturalist. There are captains out there, there are researchers, people who really depend on being able to know that these whales exist. They also serve environmentally as a method of balancing the ecosystem. There's this new understanding of what whales can do, humpbacks and all the approximately 90 other species of whales, that they serve as kind of a pump to circulate nutrients throughout the system. Because they are so large, they are able to maintain great body weight. They eat a lot, and they poop a lot, they excrete a lot, and they're able to cycle nutrients through the environment. Now, they don't ever just swim in one space, like right here in one part of the ocean's depth. They travel up and down and throughout the depths of the ocean. And so as they do that and they're excreting, they're moving nutrients with them and recycling them so they can be used in a different way. So that's the idea of the whale pump. It's a fairly new thought. It's recently come out as something that is an important role that whales have. Also, whales have an extremely important role, not just when they're alive, but also once they've died. If they do die in the ocean and don't wash ashore, their bodies eventually sink to the ocean floor, and that area serves as almost a reef for other animals to live off of. Starting from the very largest creatures like sharks and fish who might feed off of the flesh of the animal, all the way to the point where they become a skeleton and their body actually serves as a rack for different organisms to live off of and be protected from predators. So many things. I mean, I could go on all night about how important these animals are and the role that they serve in their own watery community. And of course, much is being done to protect these animals. I myself have taken an integral role in understanding how whales like the humpbacks function and where they go. There are education programs on every coast. There are mandatory laws and also voluntary guidelines for boat operators to abide by so that we have better awareness and understanding and can put into effect some methods to conserve the population and protect them. Each individual, their welfare is really important. We don't want to injure them. So we try to abide by guidelines and understand what some of the laws are, such as slowing down when we get close to a whale or if we see them off in the distance and we know that there might be some in the area. Many boat operators also have access to excellent awareness technology. They use things like AIS and VHF radios to contact each other if there are whale sightings in the area. There are reporting protocols. I'm sure you've all heard of the U.S. Coast Guard. They actually do quite a lot for whales, which is nice. And then there's everyday people like you and me who just really love and care about whales simply for the enjoyment of looking at them. And so there are citizen science programs in place where people, even just on whale watch boats, can report things that they see and collect data to help kind of support the whole process of protecting these animals. I particularly love this picture that we see here on the slide with protections for the whales. It's actually totally crooked because it was a little windy and I didn't quite have my feet underneath me. This picture was taken off of Provincetown, Massachusetts. There are 3 different individuals here. The closest one in the foreground is right here. And I like it because it's that first stage in the dive of the whale, or the fluking tail dive. So you can see here the back is humped. The next whale, which is just a little further back here, we see that the tailstock behind the dorsal fin is starting to lift out of the water, and you just see a little bit of the tail coming out of the water. And then this third whale in the back here has actually already lifted its tail out of the water and is making a deep dive. So it's a really neat picture to be able to see all the stages of a diving whale. Moving on, I want to show the incredible anatomy of the humpback whale. They're really fun to look at. And so I wanted to point out some of the most important features of their body. Before I do, does anyone have any questions right now? I think I might not have seen any comments. No questions from the peanut gallery out there? No? Okay. Must be me. I'm quite a talker. Sorry about that. I just get real excited about whales. In any case, what you're looking at here is the open mouth of a humpback whale, and it's a particularly interesting thing because the mouth, this here is the upper jaw, this is the lower jaw. The mouth is completely full of water. It turns out this whale is actually feeding at the moment, and the way that whales do that, it's very hard to explain unless you were actually seeing it. But they have this expandable pouch underneath their throat, and it is an amazing sight to see when they lunge out of the water. And with their mouth open, of course, they're going to take in a whole lot of water, and it's stored in this stretchy pouch underneath their jaw. And that pouch is basically like an expandable, like a balloon or like a frog's pouch. It's called rorquals, and they expand like a balloon when the water goes in it, in some cases up to about 500 gallons of water. So we're talking about basically a swimming pool here. You can see that water here as the whale emerges from the water. The other thing that is interesting about this picture is this pink right here. I know there's some birds in the way. They were all looking for a meal. Try to circle it there. This pink, a lot of people confuse this with the tongue. It's not. It's actually the palate. It is the same part that if you touch your tongue to the roof of your mouth, you can feel that there. It's the place where you get all those pizza burns when you were a kid, right? That is the palate. And a whale, it's very long and thin because their upper jaw is very small or skinny. This other furry-looking thing that you see here, which lines only the upper jaw, and of course now I'm making a mess. Maybe I should start again. You see this sort of room-like feature. This is called baleen, and it's a really distinct, well-evolved feeding tool or mechanism for humpback whales. They are filter feeders, and like other whales who are very large, they are baleen whales. They, instead of having teeth, they use this brush-like tool here attached to their upper jaw to filter out the food. So instead of eating large things, these whales have a very small throat, like smaller than the size of a dinner plate. And what they do is when they take in these great swoops of water, they are able to filter out any of the fish and other organisms that they're eating in it. When they close their mouth, they spit out the water in the grooves between the baleen plates. There's many, many of them. I'm going to show you some closer pictures. So all the water actually leaves their body before it's swallowed, and only the fish are stuck behind, of course, in this brushy area here. The whale can then use its tongue to scrape the fish off of its baleen and then swallow them whole. So we'll get a couple good pictures of that. I think I have another shot here of feeding whales. So there's two whales here. There's one in the background here and one in the foreground here. You're looking at the very tip of the nose. The baleen plates that hang in a big row on either side of the animal. That long palate, a pink palate that you can see. And the great part about this picture is that we actually get a really good view of the underside of the jaw. So this is the lower jaw, also known as a dentary. And beneath that, you can see the expansion of these big grooves here. This skin kind of folds up a little bit more when it's not filled with water during feeding. But you can see these lines expanding just like a balloon, and then it sort of deflates and goes right back into place when the whale is done feeding or moving on to take its next bite. You might want to notice that all around here, the water is very green. These whales were blowing bubbles and making quite a ruckus in the area, and so there's a lot of churning up of the water, but what you'll see that's most obvious is that it doesn't look like the color of the water behind it, where there aren't whales feeding. And that's interesting. If you remember from the beginning of my talk, I talked quite a bit about the fact that in New England we have really, really biodiverse animals, and that reason for having the amount of different types of animals that we have here and for the high number of them is because we have very fertile water and a lot of phytoplankton that takes up space in our water, giving it that color. Really important reason for these animals. Moving on, I want to talk about some other anatomy. This is another picture of a humpback whale face. There's actually two, one in the background here and one in the foreground. And the reason why I wanted to show some different angles here of the face before I show you any pictures of the whole animal, you may have noticed I haven't done yet, is to take a look at these features right here. These little bumps. Can y'all see these little bumps? They're actually not very little at all. They're quite large. They're about the size of a grapefruit. And they are known as tubercles, or what some old fishermen from the days of yore would call stove bolts, like on a boat. And all humpback whales have this. They have these bumpy little faces that make them look like a pickle. And they are laid out in a very particular order. If you were to look down at the whale's face from above, you could see that they do make kind of a linear pattern along the face. And each one of them is actually, we think, or scientists believe, that it is a sensory organ. In the middle of every single one of these little stove bolts or tubercles is one stiff hair, just like a cat whisker. And it's believed that humpback whales use them to get a better sense of their environment happening around them, just like a cat would do in the night if it was crawling through a hole and was feeling the sides of the wall or the bed around them with their whiskers as they were traveling through in the dark. Humpback whales could really use a feature like this because they will sometimes swim to great depths to find their food, and a lot of times they will bottom feed instead of swallowing everything at the top of the water like you saw in previous pictures. And this is a great way for them to be able to get a better sense of their environment. So let's look at that face from another angle. We've moved up past the jawline here a little bit. This is the jawline here. To something a little bit more recognizable to some people. This is the area where the whales breathe. It is called the blowhole. And fortunately for you, you've also got two blowholes as well. They're called nares or nose, nostrils, right here. You can see them. They're wide open. And unlike humans, whales, including humpbacks, have the ability to control their nares muscularly. They can actually think and say, oh, okay, it's time to close the nose holes, or it's time to open them. And they do this because if they kept them open all the time, they would drown. They breathe air just like us. So when they take a dive, they close those nostrils or that blowhole. And when they come to the surface, they open them because that is where they take in air. It's also, of course, where they release air. So if you see this inset picture here, you'll notice there are two whales that are swimming. They're swimming in this direction. And you can see where the blowhole is and the ridge in front of it. It's called the splash guard. Looks a little bit like a pig nose there. That keeps extra water from falling in as they're taking a breath. And here is that big misty breath left behind the whale. A sure sign that somebody bigger than you is nearby. Another amazing feature of the humpback whale, or Megaptera novangliae, is the fact that they have these long, white, very bright, and very useful flippers. These flippers are considered the big wings of the Megaptera novangliae. If you recall, I said Megaptera or Megaptera means big wing. And although there are about 16 populations of humpback whales around the world, some are in endangered, some are not. Some of the most recognizable whale populations are ours here in North America on the eastern seaboard, and it's because they have these very distinct flippers that are usually quite white. If you were to go on the other coast, on the west coast, you might see some humpback whales in the population that travels from Hawaii to Alaska. And those whales have the very same flippers, but they tend to be on the darker side. They're a different population of whales. These are really interesting appendages, I guess I'll say, on these animals because of their pattern. You can actually tell which side is which. Now, this is a great picture of a calf. Again, I'm not showing you the whole body. We will get to that soon. But the whale is laying on its back with its flippers sticking out of the water. The chin is right here. You can tell because there's a few barnacles in this picture that are stuck to the chin. Because there's a few barnacles in this picture that are stuck to the chin. These flippers are raised out of the water in an action known as flipper slapping. Over here in whale world, we're very scientific. Flipper slapping. And you can tell which side is which because of the change in texture on each side of the flipper. Now, this side here that is like bumpy and knobbly is the same as this side. Right, and I'm going to have you think about which side is which is the front or leading edge, and which is the trailing edge. Now, this side is very smooth. You notice the difference in texture and shape there? So I want you to think about it, and moving forward as we look at other whales, you can tell me if you remember which is the leading edge, the front part of the flipper. Is it the knobby side, or is it the smooth side? Let's move on. The back end of the whale is, of course, the most symbolic. You'll see that symbol everywhere, like right here on my necklace, the humpback whale tail. This area is very famous. It's known as the fluke, and it's more important to look at in humpback whales than any other type of whale, and I promise I will tell you why. But for now, get a load of the thickness of this tail. This is the back end of the whale here. It's known as the tailstock, and it certainly is a stocky part indeed. This is only a 3-year-old whale, and I can already see all the major muscle packing on to this animal's body as it feeds on fish every day in Stellwagen Bank. These animals are capable of so much. They are migrating and swimming miles and miles, hundreds of miles, to get from one end of the coast to the other in order to move from breeding to feeding ground and vice versa. They have to have really strong, capable, and flexible muscles. And the tailstock is just where they keep the majority of them. Humpback whales, unlike fish and sharks, they don't swim with their tails going side to side. They swim with their tails going up and down. And that's a great way to be able to tell the difference between a whale and some other kind of organism in the water. If you don't get a good look at it, but you know that it's swimming with its tail up and down, you know it's a whale. Or a human who thinks they're a mermaid. So moving on, let's talk about why that tail is important. These are a couple of my favorite whales here. I love to talk about whale tails because some of them are so interesting, and a lot of them are easily recognizable. And part of that is because of the unfortunate reason that many of our humpback whale populations are endangered. There aren't an awful lot of them. But the good news is that our whales are they're very predictable in their behavior and where they go, and they tend to revisit the same areas on each end of their migration annually. And so therefore, we expect to see certain individuals coming back to us, such as the ones here on Cape Cod. So here's an example of a recognizable whale. From this one marking here, I hope you guys can actually see the little pencil drawings I'm making on here. On the right side of the fluke, it looks like your left, but we're seeing the underside or the ventral portion of the tail here. There's this one little ball. Can you see that black ball there? This whale is named Pele after the Brazilian soccer player because of that one little marking. Now, as you can see, these two animals, they both have tails that look similar. But what's different about them is their coloration. Humpback whales, unlike any other species of whale, has a very unique pigmentation or marking on the underside of their tail. Now, the top of the tail, if you think back to a few of the other pictures I've shown you, is typically very dark and doesn't really look too different from other whales unless there's a scarring or part missing of some sort. There are exceptions to that rule, of course, but generally it's the underside of the tail that we like to look at. And because humpback whales are so famous for their fluking dives where they bring their tail right out of the water, we will oftentimes be on the other side of that and get a great picture. This is a really useful technique for whale identification for researchers. Another way to be able to identify whales, especially if they're not very cooperative that day and they decide they don't want to lift their tail out of the water for you, thankfully there's other ways to be able to identify them. And one of them is along their backside here. All humpback whales have, or should have, this fin on the body, and that is called the dorsal fin because it's on the dorsal or the backside of the animal, as opposed to the ventral side or the underside of the tail that we were just looking at. Here's another example in our picture on the right of a ventral side of a humpback whale, but you'll notice there's something a little bit different about this whale. Missing something, the very tip of its tail. This is a really well-known humpback whale. Her name is Venom. She is a great reproducer. She's brought back a lot of calves to Cape Cod in the past. But there was one year where we thought she might not because she had an interaction with some kind of human impact. I believe she had an entanglement where some active fishing gear got wrapped around her tail and actually caused that portion of the tail to fall off. Venom managed to make a full migration, recover from this significant injury, and also come back the very next year with a calf. If you were to enlarge the picture, which unfortunately I'm not able to do here, you would notice the reasoning for her name. It is on this side of the tail, and it is two little digs that come down from the top or the trailing edge of the tail. They look just like two fang marks, and that is why her name is Venom. And then, of course, another way to identify whales, especially if you can't see their tail, are other features like scars, markings on their body. So here is a case where it's unknown what happened to this individual in the bottom picture here. I've kind of laced the three pictures together, so it's hard to tell where one ends and one begins. But this is the backside or the dorsal side of a whale. And you can see there's some depression and pock marks in the skin here, and those are not natural. And it's something that if photographed can be followed up in a different year and see how it heals or what it looks like. But if it tends to be a permanent mark, such as Venom's tail here, it's certainly easy to be able to recognize that animal once again. So one thing that has been popular in my previous talks is a little game I like to play with a fluke matching. And it's a great way to be able to appreciate the differences in the unique tail pigmentations on these whales. So I'm going to ask everybody on board here, please take a look at the 7 pictures you have here and tell me how many whales do you think are present. I'll give you a minute. Don't forget, there are some changes in lighting and positioning of these tails, so it might make it a little bit harder for you to see who's who in the whale world, but give it a shot, give me a guess, and I'll tell you how many there are there. We got our first guess of 6. Who else wants to play? Anybody else want to take a shot at it? getting warmer. All right, I'll let you know. Go on to the next slide and you can see, based on the frame color, there are actually 4 whales here. If you look really close, you can see that the only one that is an individual and doesn't have a copied picture is this lady right here. Her name is Wizard, and she is named Wizard after the pattern that is at the base of her beak. It looks like a wizard holding up a staff with a cape behind him. I don't know if you can kind of see that. It is small, but you can sort of appreciate it. So, pretty neat though, and also very tough for some of the folks out there that spend a lot of time crossing their eyeballs over and over trying to figure out which whale is who. So I love to be able to talk about humpback whales, and that is one of the most enigmatic and interesting things about them. I know we don't have a ton of time, but I did want to address a list of interesting behaviors here. This set of behaviors is by no means exhaustive, but it does include some of the better ones, like tail lobbing, where a whale flaps its tail up and down on the water, and flipper slapping. You saw a picture of before. Humpback whales are incredibly vocal. That's how they communicate, and they sometimes will attract mates with their singing. They're quite famous for that in their breeding ground. Of course, whales are mammals and they do nurse, so mom and calf have a very special relationship there. There is the behavior known as logging, which you see here in this upper right-hand corner here. Logging is simply floating on the surface of the water log. It's really just a form of resting. There are some even more interesting and active surface behaviors, like lunge feeding, bubble net feeding, which we'll see a picture of, and also kick feeding, which is here in this lower portion of the slide here. And that is a way for humpback whales to stun fish by smacking the water with their tail and confusing the fish. We also see spy hopping, which is a great way for whales to stick their nose and their head out of the water and see what's going on around them. So here's a picture of that. You are looking for features. This is the jawline or dentary, the lower jaw. On the underside, you can see the rorquals or pleats, and they're not expanded in this picture, so it's a great way to see what the chin of a whale looks like when it's not filled with water. And of course, some of those tubercles also exist on the chin as well as on top of the head. That's a great question, Bridget. So I'm getting a question, are all these photos that I have taken? The answer is, other than the map at the very front that I attributed to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, yes, every one of these are my photos from either my personal craft where I went whale watching on my own or while whale watching professionally with a small private charter company on Cape Cod, Massachusetts called Sea Salt Charters. And I'm very, very grateful to that company because it's a very small boat that we take out, and we're very responsible and careful around these whales. And being able to have close encounters with them is certainly quite an interesting encounter. So let me give you a taste of some of those with a few pictures I've put together as GIFs. Look yourself at bubble net. So here's a whale coming out of the water. You can see that palate right there, and on either side, with the open mouth, there's lots of baleen here, and around it, the water is absolutely churning with the bubbles that this whale has been blowing to stun and confuse and capture the fish. That's a good action shot. You'll see behind it, there are a couple other whales in the area beginning to bring their noses right out of the water. I'm also getting the question, how big is your craft? These whales are huge. And yes, they are. You know, how could I be so silly and forget to tell you that the average humpback whale in Stellwagen Bank is between 45 and 50 feet long. But some within the species in different populations can reach a body length of 56 feet. And that is quite incredible. They are not the largest whales of all, though. The blue whale holds that particular prize, and those whales can reach a whopping 106 feet, which is about 3 school buses long. So try that for a grocery bill. Let's take a look and see another example of bubble net feeding with that open mouth. All that water coming out, gallons and gallons of it. You can see the birds coming in, trying to get a little scoop for themselves. And breaching, which is, of course, everyone's favorite. Hurling out of the water and coming down onto the surface in the world's biggest belly flop is such an interesting and fun behavior, and not one that we really know every single thing about yet. It's thought that maybe it's for communication, or to scratch an itch, or to aid in digestion. But the great thing about breaching is it really is just looking like a lot of fun, and it's very exciting to watch. So I'm getting a question again about how big of the groups do the whales hang out in? And that's a great question, and one I do love to address when I'm working on the whale watch boats. Humpback whales are baleen whales, and they're large whales. And whales like this tend to move under their own power and of their own accord. They don't tend to hang out in large family units known as pods, which you've probably heard that word before, a pod of whales. We think about pods of whales with very social marine mammals, like dolphins, the largest of which, of course, is the orca. And the pod is really a family unit that can be very small, just a few animals, all the way to super pods, which can range over 10,000 individuals. We don't see that with larger whales like the humpbacks. My thought on that is just that when you get to be a bigger animal, there's a lot more food competition if you have lots and lots of whales hanging out at the same time trying to compete for the same food. But the relationship that these whales have together is that they sometimes come together in aggregations or small groupings where they do what's called associate, and they just come together long enough to complete a task. And that task might be to protect a calf or baby whale, or it might be to obtain food or to get away from a predator. The most well understood and the closest relationship that we see among large whales is that which exists between the mom or cow and the baby or calf until about 1 year of age, when those individuals are weaned and eventually go off on their own. So I kind of want to wrap up by telling you how you can help whales, the humpbacks notwithstanding. And a lot of people ask about this, like, what can I do because I don't live near the ocean? But really, every action matters, whether it's to pick up trash around you or to start a conversation, to build awareness, or when you decide to go on vacation, to maybe take a whale watch and see for yourself what you've been missing. Here on the eastern seaboard, we report as many sightings as we can so we know where these animals are. And there's multiple ways to do that with research groups like Whale and Dolphin Conservation, which is an amazing international organization, or through the U.S. Coast Guard. You can certainly support marine conservation by being involved with non-profit or NGOs, non-governmental groups, and you can certainly learn about the different policies that engage healthy oceans in general, like the National Ocean Policy. And of course, being able to just get out there and experience nature is so important, so you can appreciate it for yourself. So at this point, I will take any questions you might have. I do see that there are a couple here. All right, so how do whales nurse underwater? Let's see. Well, I'm going to have to use a model for this one. Hold, please. All right. So it really doesn't do it justice, but here's about a 3 foot or so model of a Here's that nose I was telling you about with the tubercles on top and the rorquals or pleats underneath that expand. We've of course got eyeballs, and flippers. This must be a Hawaiian whale because it certainly does not have white flippers. And then here's the thing: they've got these long bodies, and on the underside, just like humans, they've got nipples. But here's the difference: whales are shaped like an airplane. See that? How they're so tapered with wings, and they're fusiform like an airplane. And it only makes sense for them to be ergonomic. So they have to be real smooth. So they have these sets of nipples that actually fold into their flesh and are only encouraged to expand outward when the calf goes underneath the mom and nudges them. So what you'll end up seeing is a whale mom sitting in the water at the top. Maybe you'll just see her fin. And the calf will come along and just sort of kind of nudge her and poke her in the side. And that would be where the calf comes in contact with the nipple. And then very thick, almost curdly looking milk comes out and goes directly into the calf's mouth. It has to be really thick because otherwise it would just dilute into the water and away from the whale. It's a very special thing to be able to see a baby whale nurse. And the good thing about being up here in New England is that you get chances to see that if you're on the water and are being very quiet and not making any waves, because the calves need to feed a lot every single day, enough to take in 50, sometimes 80 gallons worth of milk in a day in order to gain in excess of 100 pounds a day as they make their way to a large-scale animal. It definitely takes a lot of energy. And some of these mom whales or cows can lose 25% of their body weight or more in a year just to feed their calves. And that's on top of eating a ton of food a day. So pretty interesting stuff. I want to encourage everyone, as we wrap up for the evening here, I know I'm pretty much out of time, to get outside and whatever makes you happy, enjoy it while it's here. Because sure, you've all heard the knell of the danger bell on the situation with the environment, and it can be quite a depressing thing. But I don't want anyone to leave the conversation feeling like it's all doom and gloom, because there's so many people out there who care, and our behaviors individually and as a whole are beginning to change the tide. See what I did there? The tide. They're changing the tide on some of the environmental issues that we face today, including those with the humpback whales. The ones here in New England were recently taken off of the endangered species list and put on the protected list after all of the work and awareness that had been put out to both boat operators and just general citizens here. It's just a really exciting and interesting thing to engage in and talk about. So if you ever want to do that, folks, feel free to visit me on Twitter at OceanDevotion84 or on the water if you ever want to come down this area. And I'm just going to end things by saying thank you so much to Sherry Tarantino and Kelly Hayward of the Orca Conservancy for having me on to talk about whales tonight. Of course, my very favorite thing in the universe. And of course, to all the folks at the Nat Bio Teach-In. What an incredible program with such amazing reach. You guys are really paving the road for better things to come. I look forward to more presentations. If anybody would like to reach out, feel free to do so. And have a great time on the next round of presentations. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Bye.